time at the end for questions, and hopefully you all will help me provide answers as well, because some of these things I'm certain that you know more about than I do. Just as an overview, November 4th is the election day. Polls are open 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. You have to register by October 20th. I know you're all registered, but if you guys are friends and aren't, you have to request a mail ballot by October 28th. So there are two ballot initiatives that have been placed there by the state legislature. One is a bond and one is a constitutional amendment. And there are 4 items that are the result of petition signatures. 3 are statute initiatives. 1 is a referendum. So that's a variety of types of issues that we'll see this time around. And it's also the general election for all the other things that we're having forums on. Voter information guide, 79 pages long, and it doesn't even include everything. There's an addendum. So I'm just providing a snapshot. There's a lot more information there. There's more information in the legal aid voter pros and cons as well. The first thing they're voting on is Proposition 1. It's a legislative bond act. The numbering is a little bit weird this time around in that we're voting on 1 and 2, and then we skip ahead to like 45. And the reason for that is the legislature put the first 2 there, and they get the power to renumber their stuff. And some things were removed and added late, so that's the reason for the numbering. So number 1 is a state water bond. I assume a lot of you know a lot more about water than I do, so we can have a discussion about that later if you like. It would authorize $7.1 billion in new general obligation bonds, and it would redirect $425 million in already approved bonds that haven't been sold yet. The repayment would be in the general fund. Repayment costs would be about $360 million a year for 30 years, starting 10 years from now. Basically, it's a smaller version of a bill that has been around for a couple of years now. There were problems with some of the initial versions of that bill. The governor didn't like it, thought there's too much pork. And so this is a streamlined version of that bill that's several $billion less, but it still addresses some of the main issues. California's population has doubled since the big water projects of the Pat Brown era. This would encourage new water projects, essentially. Where does the money go? $4.2 billion goes to dams, groundwater replenishment and recycling programs, about $1.5 billion to watershed restoration programs, $1.4 billion to water quality issues, and then $395 million to flood management. This money would all be administered by the California Water Commission, and typically in a formula where recipients provide a 50% local match. So it would be going to counties or water districts that have particular plans that fit within the categories. And some of these are pretty clearly spelled out in the language of the Bond Act. So raising the Shasta Dam, for example, could probably only be applied for by 100 folks. The pros, we need a comprehensive state water plan and reliable supply of a large amount of water. This would create more storage for use in dry years. The cons, opponents say too much of the money goes to dams, which don't actually create more water, and it does not address short-term drought relief, and it doesn't promote regional self-sufficiency, and it allocates too much of our Northern California water to big agriculture. Polls, when available, I'll tell you poll numbers for each of these. These are all done by the field poll, which is the most reliable statewide polling in California. This was running at 52% yes, 27% no, and 21% undecided. Although most folks are not familiar with the particulars of the act, Republicans would be the voters most likely to vote no in looking at the demographics of that poll. Folks in support include the legislature, Governor Brown, Farm Bureau Federation, Nature Conservancy, and the California Chamber of Commerce. Groups opposed include a group called Food and Water Watch, a group called Restore the Delta, and Southern California Watershed Alliance. Moving on. Number 2 is called the Budget Stabilization Act. Again, this is put there by the legislature. It would be a constitutional amendment. And the purpose here would be to replace the existing rainy day fund that we have. That's essentially what a budget stabilization fund is. We have one right now, which we voted on in 2004. Doesn't have any money in it, which speaks to the argument that maybe it's not very effective. So this does the same thing with a new approach. It's a constitutional amendment rather than a statute, and hopefully it would result in an account that has money in it. It would require an annual transfer of 1.5% of revenues, which currently is about $1.6 billion, to a budget stabilization or rainy day account, and for the next 15 years at least would require the state to use funds to pay down its debt. And most state debt is in the form of money that it owes to public pensions or money owed to local governments. It would also require a transfer of capital gains revenues when those revenues are greater than 8% of the general fund to go into this account and into a reserve fund for K-14, and it would also cap local school district revenues at 10%. Currently, most districts in California have reserves between 1% and 5%. It would also increase the target for the rainy day fund account from $8 billion, which is the current target or goal, sort of maximum to put in there, to $11 billion. A budget emergency would be required in order to not pay into the account. The governor and the legislature would have to declare this a budget emergency. One of the knocks on the current plan is that it only requires the governor to say there's an emergency. It would also limit the amount withdrawn in any given year. So we would essentially we'd end up paying down our debt faster, but we'd have less money for other things because we'd be putting this amount of money into this rainy day account each year. So folks in favor say this establishes a constitutional reserve fund that would allow the state to pay down its debt and force the state to save money. It protects schools during bad economic years, and it stabilizes taxing and spending. Folks opposed? Mostly focus on the school issue. Right? They say that it limits school district reserves, which could result in higher costs for local district borrowing, and could result in deeper cuts. Local school districts should be able to decide the size of their own reserves. There's been no polling that I could find on number 2. Supporters include the legislature. It passed the Senate 36-0, the Assembly 78-0. Governor Brown, California Chamber of Commerce, California State Board of Education, the League of Women Voters, and it's also got several newspaper endorsements. Opposition comes mostly from a group called Educate Our State, which, according to them, is a grassroots parent-led organization. I couldn't find out much more about it. I was just mostly focused on opposing this amendment, and the Association of California School Administrators. So the pro and con of this issue mostly focuses on the capping of local school district reserves. There isn't a lot of opposition, at least in print, about the concept of having a rainy day fund. We already have one of those. Now we get to the propositions that the voters put there by petition. Number 45 is the next one, and it's about health insurance rates. What this would do is grant our state insurance commissioner approval and rejection power over rate changes. Currently, the state insurance commissioner only has an advisory role and doesn't have the power to actually approve and reject rate changes. It wouldn't affect all health insurance, but only plans that are small employer plans, so 50 employees or less, and individual plans. So in total, this would affect about 16% of Californians. It would create a process that's similar to what the insurance commissioner does for auto and home insurance rates. Remember, we created this position in 1988 to have an elected insurance commissioner to do that for home and auto insurance, and to expand that role to certain types of health insurance plans as well. And so the job there of our insurance commissioners to make sure rates are not excessive, the coverage is not inadequate or unfairly discriminatory. Those in favor say this would help limit rapidly increasing health insurance rates, which have gone up at about 5 times the rate of inflation. would require greater transparency by the insurance companies, which would help prevent unreasonable rate hikes. The process has been successful with home and auto insurance, and this would simply expand it. And the problem with the current review process is that there are no teeth there. The folks reviewing rate changes for health insurance cannot stop them from going into effect right now. Those opposed say this adds another layer of bureaucracy, and that decisions about health care costs should not be made by a politician, and that a commission already exists to review rates. Polling shows 41% yes, 26% no, 33% undecided, and rich folks are most likely to say they vote no on this. Votes in favor include California Nurses Association, Consumer Watchdog, Dolores Huerta, the Democratic Party, and United Food and Commercial Workers. And they've put the total funding in support was under $1 million, as far as I can tell so far. The groups opposed: American Nurses Association of California, California Chamber of Commerce, California Association of Rural Health Clinics, and they're not rich groups, but people who've put up $37.5 million are Kaiser, WellPoint, Blue Cross Blue Shield. So you can see the battle here is really about big insurance companies being opposed to this, some other sort of watchdog groups being in favor of it, and we'll have to see how the commercials play out, how the actual campaign works here. I think that's always the most interesting part. The field poll does a lot of polling in, say, August or November election, which is usually before you've seen or heard anything about the propositions. So the numbers end up usually changing quite a bit after you start receiving things in the mail or seeing commercials or start thinking about these measures in more detail. Proposition 46 is on medical negligence. It does three different things. First, it would raise the cap for pain and suffering in lawsuits. Currently, that cap is $250,000. It's the lowest in the nation. We set that cap in 1975, and we didn't provide a mechanism for it never changing, so that's why it's still there. This would raise that cap to $1.1 billion, and it would peg it to the rate of inflation. And they picked that number $1.1 billion because that's what the $250,000 from 1975 would be today if we've been doing that all along. It would also require doctors to check a database before prescribing certain drugs in order to prevent patients from securing the same prescription from multiple physicians. So an effort to reduce prescription shopping or prescription drug abuse. And third, it would require random drug and alcohol testing of doctors, as well as tests based on suspicion or after potential negligence events. And it would empower the state medical board to suspend or discipline physicians for failing the test. Those in favor say it would save lives by reducing prescription abuse and protecting patients from preventable medical errors by impaired doctors. Those opposed say it would increase the cost of malpractice insurance, which would increase healthcare and litigation costs, and it would increase costs to the state by tens or hundreds of millions annually due to increased litigation, for example. Yes?
Is there a random database that a doctor can check?
Yes, the database for checking prescriptions already exists, but physicians are not required to check it when they're prescribing. So the information is entered there, it exists, it's just not required.
Thank you.
And those opposed also say that the real goal is just to increase medical malpractice awards, which mostly benefits attorneys. Polling finds 34% yes, 37% no, 29% undecided, and demographics are kind of all over the place. So I would say this is one where we haven't made up our minds as Californians, and I also suspect it's one where we'll see a lot of mail and advertising over the next couple of months. 34 yes, 37 no, 29 undecided. Yes.
Do you know if there are any challenges to this one? Because it seems as if it's two different topics.
Yeah, it seems like it's three different topics, but it's all about medical negligence. So that's what they're putting it under the rubric of. Anytime we, as you well know, anytime we put something on the ballot via the initiative process and petitions, it has to be reviewed to make sure that it meets the requirements of an initiative. It can only be about one topic, but then what we mean by one topic depends on who's reviewing it. The Attorney General has some latitude there. Yep.
Charley, the first star under opponents say that Proposition 46 uses drug testing of doctors to disguise a true intent. That sounds like the doctors are going to be randomly.
Yes.
Yeah, that's part of what it does. It requires random drug or alcohol testing of doctors. Yes?
Aren't doctors, because of access, one of the highest groups of people who become addicted to drugs?
Yes.
I don't know any information about doctor addiction.
I think that's pretty well.
It is true.
Right, but that's not my job right here to tell you that doctors are dealing drugs.
Different issue.
So, folks in support include groups like Consumer Watchdog, Congress of California Seniors, and Consumer Attorneys of California. They've spent about $5.5 million. Mostly that's come from attorneys. Those opposed include American Nurses Association, Citizens Against Lawsuit Abuse, the California Association of Nurse Practitioners, the Republican Party, and the ACLU. And they've spent about $55 million, most of that money coming from insurance companies and medical providers. 2 more, and then we can have even more questions. 47 is on criminal sentencing. This would reduce some nonviolent felonies, namely theft and forgery of $950 or less, and drug possession, to misdemeanors. And this would, the estimate is this would affect about 40,000 people annually. Felonies typically require at least a year in state prison, followed by parole or probation oversight. This would shift those convicted to local jails or community supervision. Though most folks with no violent priors are already in local jails because of AB 109 reshuffling that's the legislature passed a couple of years ago. And in most cases, this would reduce sentence length as well. There would be exceptions for a conviction history of violent or serious felonies. It would allow resentencing in many cases. You have to apply for this, but if you're already serving a sentence that's a felony that's now been knocked down to a misdemeanor, you could apply to have your case changed. And if you've already served your time and are out, but have this felony conviction on your record, you could apply to have that changed to a misdemeanor as well. It would save both the state and counties hundreds of millions of dollars annually in reduced incarceration and oversight costs. The savings would go to a Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund for programs to prevent dropouts and truancy. That would be 25%. Programs for victim services would be 10%, and drug treatment and mental health programs would be 65%. Those in favor say it would save hundreds of millions annually. The money currently spent on prisons would be redirected to programs for schools and treatment. Those opposed say that over 10,000 dangerous criminals would be released because the list of prior felony exceptions is not extensive enough. It would be harder for judges to properly release, and it generally removes too much discretion from judges and prosecutors. And it would overburden local jails and will fill the courts with resentencing hearings. Polling finds 57% in favor, 24% opposed, 19% undecided, and the majority of folks who identify as both Democrats and Republicans and independents were all in favor. But the polling was done in June, so again, that's pretty early for getting people's reactions to a November validation. Groups in support include a lot of organized groups, AFL-CIO, American Federal State, County, Municipal Employees, United Food and Liberation Teachers, Democratic Party, League of Women Voters, California Labor Federation, ACLU, NAACP. Those opposed are mostly in law enforcement, so California Police Chiefs Association, California District Attorneys Association, Crime Victims United, California State Sheriff's Association, also CalCASA, which is California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and the California Peace Officers Association. The final thing that we're voting on is a referendum. So the state legislature passed a law. Some citizens decided they didn't want the law to go into effect, so they created a petition and gathered signatures for that. So here, a yes vote would approve 2 gaming compacts that were agreed to by the legislature and governor already. A no vote would mean that we don't approve the law. So this affects 2 groups. First is the North Fork Rancheria, who would give them the okay to build a new casino on tribally owned but non-reservation land, which is about 38 miles from their reservation. It would also affect the Wyandotte tribe, which is in Humboldt County. It would tell them that they could not build a casino for environmental concerns, but instead they would get to share in some of North Fork's revenues from their casino. It would result in payments by tribes of about $1.5 million annually to offset state and local government costs. Madera County, which is where the North Fork Rancheria is, would get about $16 to $35 million in one-time payments, and then about $5 to $10 million per year thereafter. If you're not familiar with the North Fork Rancheria, where that is, or where Madera is exactly, it's between Fresno and Merced, sort of the central eastern part of the state. If you look in the voter information guide, there's a nice map that explains all of the politics of this referendum just by looking at that picture, I think. The pros, the folks in favor say it would create about 4,000 jobs in Madera County and bring additional revenue to the county and state. Those opposed say that casinos are only supposed to be on reservation lands. This would reduce jobs and resources in surrounding areas and open a floodgate of off-reservation casinos. There's been no polling that I could find on this one. The money in support comes from the tribe with the casino. The money opposed comes from the tribes with casinos nearby. So that's the just the economics of this issue. Those in favor, the governor, the board of supervisors from Madera County, the Democratic Party, the California Labor Federation. Those opposed, a Fresno County supervisor, the Moortown Rancheria, which is the competition, and Sacramento Via actually wrote an interesting editorial on this one as well. So really the 2 issues here are casino competition, but then the second one is this more theoretical issue of should we allow for off-reservation casinos, and this would be the first one of those we would allow in California. So that's kind of the gist of it. Are there things we should talk about in more detail that you have questions about? Yes, sir.
Regards to 47, do felons in California lose their right to vote? And if they do, would those be restored if those felonies are used to be used?
Can you repeat the question for 26?
So the question is about, do you lose your voting rights if you're convicted of a felony in California? You don't lose your rights permanently in California, so you wouldn't have the right to vote while you're incarcerated. So to the extent that it would shorten your sentence, then it might increase the number of eligible voters in that way. Yeah, that's it.
I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer to this
That's
question. But I'm rather annoyed that Proposition 47 is titled Criminal Sentences, Misdemeanor Penalties, but the league in their recommendation has a totally different title.
Well, but what did so this is about, the question's about the title of Prop 47.
Yeah.
What did the league calls it? Criminal sentences, misdemeanor penalties.
No, the league has Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, and
Well, and then in pros and cons, though, it's criminal sentences, misdemeanor penalties. Yeah, I think that that's an interesting example of the two different functions that the league serves. When the league is advocating for something, they give it whatever title sounds best. And when they are presenting objective information, they have to say it objectively. So criminal sentences, misdemeanor penalties is what the state would allow it to be called. And then certainly if you're advocating a proposition, you want to emphasize the fund for schools.
I think it's deceptive.
We don't speak against the league.
Well, I also, this again is out of the realm of neutral pros and cons. But again, I would like to point out that there is a big difference between leagues saying they're neutral and have no stand. And so when we are doing our pros and cons, and this comes up, no stand means that league has nothing to say about it.
Right, and in this case, what was the one that the league reviewed and
It was
Number one.
number, so
It went
the
to
Water Bond Act?
The water's in there.
Obviously, the league has a lot of knowledge about water policy. It's one of the things that the league takes a lot of stands on. So it wasn't the case that the league said, hey, this isn't one of our areas, we don't know what to do. This is one that they reviewed and could not come to a consensus on one side or the other, so they remained neutral.
There were parts of it that they just could not lend support to, but many parts of it they found.
When you're talking about $7 billion in a lot of parts. Jim?
The real problem for the league with these presentations is steering a safe policy on advocacy versus education. The pros and cons are an education activity, yet advocacy creeps in when we say the league supports yes or no.
Yes.
And so over the time I've been associated with doing these, it's a tightrope that you're walking to make sure, because if the league is accused of advocating, they lose a tax benefit that they now enjoy. So it has to be done very carefully.
And you do it very well.
It's a good point, where Jim and I walk that tightrope. Yeah, so the reason that I do mention the league's policy, the league's position when it takes a position is it's within the context of telling you what other groups are doing as well, rather than speaking on behalf of the league. Yes.
I'm curious, does 47 do anything in the definition of misdemeanors? I went to a juvenile justice presentation here, and the district attorney and some sheriff guy were talking about the people that are being transferred to the local jails. They are really violent, many of them are, and I wondered, does this do anything about talking about what a misdemeanor is?
This doesn't change, this is about Prop 47, does it change the definition of misdemeanor? It does not change anything about the definition of misdemeanor. It only changes the definition of felony in the sense that it takes some select crimes that are currently either felonies or what's sometimes called wobblers. They can be either felonies or misdemeanors, and it redefines them as misdemeanors. So if you forge a check for $900, currently that's a felony. If this passes, that would be a misdemeanor. If you, certain drug possession crimes that are currently felonies, and again, this wouldn't be intent to sell, this would be private use possession, that are currently felonies would be reduced to misdemeanors. Those are probably the two most relevant examples. But you're right that one of the concerns that opponents have raised is about violence that isn't captured through someone's criminal record, right? So there's a trigger if somebody has a conviction for certain types of violent felonies in the past, that they wouldn't be able to have these crimes reduced to misdemeanors. But as happens sometimes in the criminal justice system, you're originally charged with this crime, you're eventually convicted of something lesser, even though there was violence in the acts that you're being convicted of, you're not actually being convicted of a violent felony. And so, you know, there are a lot of complications in the criminal justice system. Yes.
Just to draw that a little further, there are also complications in even getting the information. I mean, I could behave in a manner that you could behave in, and for whatever reason, I escaped that criminal justice system entirely. So I have no record, and you may have had your charges reduced, and therefore you have no record. So either one of us could be violent people. We cannot control everything. We can only look at the best way that we can figure out, okay, does this constitute something that's violent, or does this constitute something? We just don't know everything. It would be great if we were all omniscient, but we're not.
Yeah, the omniscient proposition did not make
Yeah, I was looking for it.
Maybe it's,
And, you know, I wish it was there.
no, that's a good one.
Any other questions for Charlie?
Yes.
The law that's in effect 3 points and you're out, how does that play into this?
Yeah, so how is the 3 strikes law affected by this? Well, that third strike, remember we already changed this a little bit a couple of years ago when we said that we're really talking about violent felonies, right? We're going to lock somebody up for life. So this doesn't affect violent felonies, but it's certainly the case that you know, if previous to passing 47, somebody racked up a number of felonies, and then they got that third strike with a violent felony, they'd be locked up for 25 to life. Here, those early felonies might actually just be misdemeanors if they were some of the things that are being reclassified in Prop 47. So it doesn't affect the third strike as much as it would have an indirect effect because of the earlier strikes.
Charlie, do you know whether or not they're talking more or less about a paper redefinition, or is this a court redefinition? In other words, does it have to go before a judge to determine whether or not this is going to be considered a wobbler, a felony, or a misdemeanor? Or is this when they're originally charged? Okay, I'm sorry.
So currently we have, you know, laws that say if you're charged with this crime, this is a felony. Now I would say if you're charged with this crime, it's a misdemeanor. Judges still have some discretion in sentencing. Right? Do you give them this sentence or this sentence? But because it is a misdemeanor instead of a felony, the class of sentences available would be different. It'd mostly be things that are, say, less than a year in local jails as opposed to more than a year in state prisons.
I guess to further that discussion, I'm wondering, could people get their previous felonies expunged then and say, like you said,
Right.
the third strikes, well, those are no longer considered felonies, so I don't have that strike, right?
Right.
But they'd have to actually go to the court, or the court would be evaluating that every time. It would be something they'd have to bring forward to get it expunged or changed, right? Previous ones.
Yeah, getting previous felonies changed is a process that you have to apply for. It's not automatic. So I think that the neutral assessment of this one is that yes, there would be sort of increased court activity initially as folks who are already a part of the system are going back and applying to how previous things changed. But once we get through that group of folks, then it wouldn't be a long-term issue. Yes.
I know that following 8109, many of the local jails, the county jails, became overwhelmed with individuals that were getting discharged. Is there any prediction on what this might do to the county jails?
Yeah, so the question is how does this affect county jails? I don't know if trickle-down economics works, but trickle-down criminal justice works absolutely in the sense that we have a system where there are state prisons which were full. So we passed 109, which took a lot of folks out of the state prison system and sent them to county and local jails. So now those places are full. So what does this do? It reduces a lot of sentences. So decisions about what to do with folks who are moving from a state prison to a local jail will have to be made locally, by those jails. My guess would be that we're talking about releasing more folks through things like we have here with electronic monitoring or check-in types of probation, because it doesn't create any more beds anymore. More criminals on the streets, but they're only misdemeanor criminals.
Maybe one more.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Among the people serving in prison who would now be relegated to county jails, have you an idea of what percentage of those people were imprisoned or would be imprisoned for simple possession of marijuana?
Practically none. Marijuana is an infraction rather than a misdemeanor, so no one's going to jail for possession. They're being fined. Personal possession. So I don't think this would affect marijuana specifically. Personal possession.
Chris?
Okay, my question's on the healthcare insurance. I'm trying to wrap my head around this one. ACA's limits 20% administration, and the rest has to go to actual care. So why would we need this? We already have that in ACA.
Okay, so this isn't for ACA plans through Covered California. This would be for just private insurance plans and folks with plans that are small business plans, so fewer than 50 employees. We have that now, but those plans can increase their rates and they can change their coverage. And when they increase their rates, then that would have to be approved by the insurance commission.
But my point is, so what if they raise their rates, the people are going to get a rebate at the end of the year anyway if they have too much profit? Right?
One of the things that, if you look at pros and cons, one of the positions against it says that marketplace negotiations under ACA could be harmed by the new regulatory approach. So you're right. I mean, the people who are arguing against this are saying that this is actually working against ACA.
I don't know if I'd say it's working against ACA as much as this may be a reason why it's not as necessary as it would have been before ACA. That might be the best way to frame that, and that may be the case. It's hard to make a commercial that says this isn't as necessary as it used to be, because that's kind of a subtle thing. So making that argument, even though it may be absolutely correct, is, I don't know, it's kind of a nuanced thing to get across to the voters. So that's why I'll be curious to see how voters react to this, because it's really easy to say we're gonna put in something to regulate the insurance hikes, but it's harder to explain why that's not particularly relevant. But you're right.
And I don't understand, I'm not familiar enough with this proposition, but when I think of the limitations placed on, for instance, the med-mal recovery issue, I'm not sure that really affected what parties could negotiate within those limits. So when I look at this, it seems to me that there is a limit that can be imposed on insurance rate increases by this commissioner. So does that really affect what can be negotiated? I wonder. I don't know how that would be any different than what we've done with the limitations on other recoveries or other increases. So I don't know if I'm getting my point across, but when we look at lawsuits and we have a cap on them for the medical recoveries of that 250,000, that doesn't mean every plaintiff who goes in there gets 250,000. Okay, so there, if they settle, there's something in between that gets negotiated. I would imagine that that would be the case here as well. But what the commissioner position does is says, you cannot raise those rates beyond this, or we have to approve that before you can raise your rates. But within what you can charge, you can negotiate what you want with the ACA, okay, with government entities.
I can't speak to that specifically, other than just to remind folks that this is two different ballot propositions.
Well, I only use that as an example to talk about, because that's a good example of something being limited. And her question was, won't that undermine the negotiations that occur? And I'm not, I think it defines the parameters.
Well, one thing that would definitely is raise the cost to get malpractice insurance as a doctor.
Okay, now we're talking about the.
Now you're talking about getting, I'm sorry you brought it up, I didn't mean
But to the one about the insurance commission
Yeah.
and its healthcare laws, and keep in mind, it's not just about raising rates, but it's also about what's covered. So even though ACA may limit profits, this is a more, I guess, individualized approach to give power to the insurance commissioner to examine the complete package of your rate change and what does it include. You may have only raised rates a little bit, but if you've also reduced coverage for some things.
I hate to cut this off. We really do need to end it. I know you still have more questions. I really appreciate that Charley took Saturday morning. He was going to go on first. Because he's a good league member, he came to the business part of the meeting. He does a great job, doesn't he? That's it for now. I hope everybody goes to the forums or watches them on Channel 11, the ones that are in Chico. And hope you come to our other meetings that we're going to have during the year and sign up for some committee. Just to do a little bit. You don't have a lot to do, but I think it'd be a good time to get together with some